to all of our housing task members and our distinguished guests. Representative Mabry is with us this morning from the Colorado Legislature. And just our monthly task force meetings are meant to inform and engage members across the state to promote collective actions around housing issues. And in doing this, the task force hopes to influence public policy and legislation at all levels. So today we have the opportunity to hear from legislators who sponsored 2 housing related bills that the League's Legislative Action Committee voted to support. So we are extending a very special welcome to Representative Mabry, who represents District 1, and he will be sharing details on House Bill 23-1171 around just cause eviction. And before we start, I just want to see if Senator Gonzalez has been able to join us yet.
She just hopped on.
Great.
Yeah, Trish, I just want to clarify for Representative Mabry that the League is in support of 1115 and is monitoring 1171.
Okay, great. I have my co-prime sponsor here of 1115. And Trish, I don't know. I know that I saw both 1115 and 1171 are on the agenda. While I have my co-prime sponsor for 1115, do you guys want us to chat about that one?
Well, the only reason I would say we'd stick with the 1171 is because we have Senator Gonzalez here with us now, and she's on a 15-minute time frame.
Oh, okay, great.
So if we could, and I do want to introduce Senator Gonzalez, and thank you for coming. She is the majority whip and represents District 34. So I'm going to turn it over to Senator Gonzalez and Representative Mabry to tag team on 1171.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here and grateful for the opportunity to chat. Julie Gonzalez, I represent Northwest and Downtown Denver, and serve as the chair of the Judiciary Committee and Legal Services Committee, and do a bunch of other committees too. I just live in committee these days. Happy to chat with you all about just cause eviction protections, which in my sense is just a mechanism for us to really spell out and clarify what are just causes, what are good cause eviction protections, rationales for evicting someone, and what are not. And happy to be joined in this effort by Representative Mabry and also Representative Gonzalez Gutierrez. I will kick it over to him, since this is a House bill, and proceed forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Senadora. And thank you all for having me. And I'm really excited to discuss House Bill 1171. It's actually really fitting. The timing of this meeting is perfect because this legislation is going to committee on Wednesday of this week. So, the senator did a good job of sort of giving us the 30,000-foot view, right? Like, our goal with this legislation is to hash out what is a good reason for a landlord to remove a tenant. So I think folks on this call know that my day job outside the Capitol, I am an eviction defense. I'm a housing attorney. And through that work, our primary mission is we're trying to stop new cases of homelessness. We're trying to prevent unnecessary displacement. And so one of the key policies that we need to get done in order to prevent that unnecessary displacement is House Bill 1171. So earlier this winter, I had the honor of attending a meeting of state legislators from across the country that was convened by the White House. And in it, the White House was trying to suss out a big policy platform that they wanted to put out on homelessness, housing, and renters' rights. And on that call, I was one of many legislators who mentioned that we wanted to work on just cause for eviction proceedings. or a just cause for eviction legislation. And I was proud to see that about 3 weeks ago, the White House put out their platform for renters' rights and stopping new cases of homelessness, and good cause eviction protections was included in this. And so I just saw a question in the chat about this applying to non-renewal of a lease as well. Yes, it does. If it did not apply to non-renewal of a lease, the legislation actually wouldn't do anything, because what we are trying to do is we're saying all of the existing for-cause reasons for eviction remain law, right? So if a tenant isn't paying their rent, if a tenant is violating an essential term of the lease, if the tenant is violating a more minor provision of the lease and they've been given a chance to fix that and they haven't cured it within the statutory cure period, if a tenant is using the premises for an illegal purpose, all of these reasons you will still be able to remove a tenant. What we are trying to do with this legislation, and why the White House is pushing states to pass this sort of legislation, is that lease non-renewal of tenants in good standing is a gigantic loophole that leads to discrimination against tenants. We see, both Senador and I have heard from constituents, people we work with, about horror stories where, a landlord, let's say you're complaining about the heat not working, there being bed bugs, there being roaches, etc. Oftentimes tenants are afraid to make those complaints because they're worried that their landlord, the next time their lease is up, will just opt not to renew their lease, which is perfectly legal in Colorado right now. You can essentially retaliate against the tenant for making good faith complaints. And also, I've worked on cases where there was blatant discrimination. We proved it to the judge. The judge even said there was discrimination in this case. But the lease non-renewal has created like a universal right to evict where there's almost no defenses a tenant can assert. And so again, the good way to sum up this legislation is it's basically a right of first refusal for tenants who are in good standing when their leases come up. I'm happy I can dive in more. I mean, y'all know, if anybody's worked with me, and I know the senator knows this too well, I'm really wonky and long-winded, and so I can go on and on and on and on. I can leave it there and answer questions, but that's essentially the meat and potatoes of what we're trying to do. There are various exceptions. There are no fault reasons for a landlord to move in. If the owner wants to move into the property, if the owner wants an immediate family member to move in the property, there's provisions for substantial renovations. And so you will still be able to access your property if you're a landlord. And we have a bunch of exemptions, and I don't think I necessarily need to go line by line on those, but I'll leave it there, and then we can go into questions. And I can pass it to the senator. Senadora, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I just think that this is part of a broader host of policy that we have done, that we will be addressing over the course of this legislative session, to sort of really ensure that everyone is clear on what their rights are, whether that's as a landlord or as a tenant. And it also builds upon the work that we have done over the past several years to clarify what is an individual's rights. Certainly when they find themselves in eviction proceedings, that was last or 21-173 from a while back. But then also, how do we just clarify so that fewer folks land in eviction proceedings in the first place, or find themselves, as you're mentioning, Representative, in that place where they have done everything right, they have paid their bills on time and what have you, and find themselves in this non-renewal situation. I see that there's a hand up, so.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Was wondering if you could discuss some of the amendments that you're thinking about for the committee hearing, in particular, relocation expenses.
Yeah, I think that, I'll just say that I've been really encouraged by the conversations that we've had with stakeholders throughout this process, and continue to have stakeholder meetings to understand and suss out where are the areas of concern. That has been one place where we have heard concern, and are working through amendments at this point in advance of committee in the House that's popping up. We'll have another meeting, I believe. At this point, we'll have another meeting to try to really ensure that what are the concerns that we are hearing and how can we work to address them? But I'm really proud of the process that we've gone under thus far.
Yeah, I'll just add to the senator's comments and just to specifically address the question about the relocation assistance. So we are going to be bringing amendments in committee. We are also, after working with many stakeholders, we are going to bring amendments about relocation assistance. It's just about, are we going to do it in committee? Are we going to do it before it gets out of the House? But we have heard feedback, and one thing we want to be sure of doing is, I know one of the big concerns about the relocation assistance is, like, as written, there could be a situation where it's a mom and pop who might not be able to afford the relocation assistance, or it's a nonprofit, and we want to work with stakeholders to address that concern. And so we're still working on language, and that's the only reason why it might not be in committee, it might be on the floor. It's just we're still working on language to make sure that we get that right.
That's exactly it.
All right, does anyone else have any other questions of Senator Gonzalez?
We got time for one more question.
All right, one more question, anyone?
I do. Hi, my name's Jen Dingman and I'm in Pueblo. And I just have a lot of concerns about this legislation and unintended consequences with regard to both of these bills. I've been very concerned about some past legislation with regard to the screening processes. We've heard stories of tenants that have paid up to $600 to different screening processes because there's no universal check that you can use one. And I would like to see some kind of amendment to that legislation before they do anything else, to make a 30-day window of opportunity to use a universal screening tool so it doesn't cost people a lot of money. One family paid $50, got to the lockbox, and they couldn't open it. And it's just been a disaster. I'm very concerned about the science of rent control. My son lives in LA, and he has a lot of concerns about unintended future consequences of that particular legislation with regard to people who are living in an apartment for $1,000 and they're on rent control. They might be in abusive situations and afraid to move because they're not going to be able to find anything else for that price. And then somebody wants to move in the identical apartment next door and they're going to pay $4,000. He had a lot of trouble finding a place to live. So I'm worried about how we're going to address that in Colorado. And with regard to the other legislation about the evictions, I fear I've known people who owned rental properties and they've sold them to hedge funds and corporations from out of town, out of state. And I'm really afraid that a lot of these laws are going to scare small family-owned properties, and they're going to be selling them to these hedge funds, and where you have people that our families rented our whole lives. And, I'm a homeowner now, and we have family members that have rentals, but you know, when you have the small mom and pop person owning a property, they're going to go out of their way for their tenants. When you have a hedge fund or a corporation owning one of these properties, you're going to have a lot of problems. So my son also wanted to know about, you know, evidence-based this legislation with regard to rent control. Did they do economists? What do they think about it? My son said most economists, more scientists are against climate change than economists are in favor of sustainable rent control. He's worried about gentrification and how they will find creative ways to get rid of families with children in these neighborhoods, especially in the Denver area. So I have a lot of reservations. I have a lot of questions, and I wonder if anybody else and if any of the legislators can answer some of my concerns.
So I'll just pop in, and then I apologize. I do have to bounce to another meeting. So I'll kick it over to Representative Mabry as well. But I will say that, you know, a lot of the legislation that we are putting forward recognizes and understands the fact that 90% of the time, landlords and tenants have really thoughtful and great relationships working together, and that what we are talking about when we're trying to advance this clarity on both sides is in order to get out of this framework of landlords are terrible or renters are terrible, because we know that by and large, like the relationships that landlords and tenants have been really workable, and that we're coming out of the past 3 years where there have been really complicated stressors, right? Given the pandemic and the unprecedented strains that we've gone through economically, and that by and large, people have been understanding and worked it out, right? We're talking about the edges of what happens when things don't go well, right? And how do we provide that clarity for everybody? And that's really, I think, the intent behind all of this legislation. You mentioned, you know, application fees. That's a policy that's also moving through. I'm not on that bill and don't know the specific contours of that proposal. But I think that that's really at the root where we're all trying to come from, is how do you provide a sense of clarity so that everybody can have a clear sense of what the expectations are when you move in, right? What are the prospects when you start the lease, when you're in the lease, when you're in that moment of renewal, or when you find yourself in eviction proceedings? I appreciate the question and know that there's much more to discuss. I apologize, I have to bounce, but I'll kick it over to Representative Mabry.
Thank you, Senator Gonzalez, for taking the time to be with us today. We really do appreciate it. And I just want to check before we kick it over to Senator or Representative Mabry again. Has Senator Rodriguez been able to check in yet? Or Representative Velasco? I'm not seeing
Representative
that.
Velasco is hanging with me.
Okay, all right, great. All right, so we'll go back to you again, Representative Mabry, to talk to us a little bit more about House Bill 23-1115 on the local control of rents.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I can briefly just follow up on some of the remarks from the senator and just in response to the question. So these are two different policies. 1171 has been the law of the land in New Jersey since 1974. Washington State passed a bill that looks much like 1171 2 years ago. And in neither of those places, also, those are just two examples. Bills like 1171 exist in many places in the country. They did not see then a flee of small mom and pop landlords from the market, just based on the passage of that legislation. And the next thing I want to state is we made sure, working with stakeholders on 1115, and actually one of the stakeholders who we worked with on 1115 is an economist. The only economist in the legislature is a co-sponsor on 1115. And part of that was we worked with them to bring amendments that they were concerned needed to be made so that we weren't preventing the development of new housing. And so we brought an amendment that for 15 years exempts construction of new housing. And so that that's part of it. We can have a whole long conversations about. There are 25 academic studies on rent control. They have very mixed results, but almost universally, they say rent control is good for the tenants who do have the rent stabilized units. And those are people are poor, they're more likely to be people of color. And so that's what we're trying to help. We're trying to make sure that localities have those tools to help those communities. So with that, I want to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Elizabeth Velasco from the Western Slope, to talk to you a little bit about 1115.
Hi, y'all. Thank you so much for having me. We are still on the floor, so we are staying close by. But 1115 just passed the House on third reading just now, a little bit ago, and we're very excited. You know, and I was very excited to be part of this process of talking to our colleagues, to experts, to opponents and proponents of rent control, because, you know, this is about just local control, making sure that municipalities can create their own safeguards and their own, you know, guardrails around legislation that works for them. And we know that that's going to look different in the Western Slope than in urban communities, rural communities versus urban communities. And, you know, I've heard of many different ways in which it can be implemented for, you know, workforce housing and different types of housing, as we know that our working families are struggling, you know, to pay rent.
Yeah, so and you know, we also want to thank you all for your support on this legislation. It was critical. Our colleagues got emails in support of this legislation because of you all, and we really thank you for the organizing that went behind the support of House Bill 1115. It was meaningful. You know, one thing to be clear, and you know, you all know, I think you had a meeting about this legislation. It is not a statewide rent stabilization policy. It is a statewide policy. It is getting rid of a statewide ban on rent stabilization policies so that localities can build what works best for them. Now, again, working with our colleagues, we put some amendments to have some safeguards to prevent, you know, just like hard caps that don't allow for increases that reflect inflation. Again, we've exempted new construction for a period of 15 years. And yeah, I mean, with that, I don't know if Senator Rodriguez ever joined us, and if we want to pass it to him. But I think my rep Velasco and I would be happy to take more questions.
All right, we'll open up the floor then to questions. I don't see any coming through on chat, so how about anybody have a hand raised that they want to present a question? Kathy?
Yeah, thanks for congratulations on third reading this morning. So all the newspaper articles are talking about the governor planning a veto for this local control of rents bill 1115. How are you working with the governor's office on this?
Yeah, so the governor has not threatened a veto on this. The governor has stated that he's skeptical about the effectiveness of these policies. I think we're confident now after amending this policy with our colleagues. And by the way, we almost got full support of the Democratic caucus coming out of the House. So not only is this the furthest this legislation has ever been in Colorado, we almost had unanimous support from Colorado House Democrats. And so I think sort of like a statement about this legislation as introduced versus a statement now, those are different things. We've gone out of the House with near universal support. I think that we're heading to the Senate in a really strong place. And we anticipate having negotiations with the governor's office as this bill moves forward.
So there is a question in chat from Mindy. She says, she's asking, what do you see for the future of House Bill 23-1115 in the Senate and with the governor? And are there negotiations underway? Oh, where did I just go? It disappeared. Are there negotiations underway so that it can pass both?
Yeah. Thank you for your question. We're definitely still having conversations. We're feeling really strong, and we're feeling really strong. We feel like this is going to be passing the Senate and then going to Governor Polis, and we're chatting with his office, engaging in conversations, and we definitely want to ask you to reach out to your senators to continue helping the bill along.
Yeah, I'll just echo on that. Like this, so because we passed with almost unanimous support out of the House, I do think that we're in a good place to get this out of the Senate. But the Senate, just being honest, it is going to be a harder, tougher lift. And so we definitely need you all to maintain that grassroots energy, specifically focusing on members of the Housing, Transportation, and Local Government Committee in the Senate.
Will you be asking for us to testify to that committee the way we did to your House committee?
Oh, absolutely. We need more people to show up to that one. Yes.
Do you need volunteers to talk to members of the governor's office? I know there seems to be a lot of support of local elected officials on 1115. Would that be helpful to try to, we have a statewide organization to try to line up local electeds throughout the state?
Yes, we did a lot of that in the House, and I think it would be good to continue that work as we talk with the governor's office and with senators.
All right, so I think we've gotten some homework assignments here to follow up. So if there's anything else for the representatives, I know their time is valuable.
Hi, my name is Anne Marie Jensen. My question is about the amendments to 1171, and you mentioned you have a stakeholder process, and I'm active in a variety of housing arenas, and I don't know who's been invited to that stakeholder process or how people who might have an interest in that would participate. And I'm hoping you could share, so we could share with those who really have concerns about that section.
Yeah, I'm going to put my email in the chat. And if you want to send me an email about the relocation assistance, I mean, again, so what we're trying to do with any potential amendment there is we want to make sure that we're not putting a huge financial burden on a smaller mom or pop type of landlord who could not afford that relocation assistance. And so we're looking at language that we can put in that doesn't strip that from the bill entirely, but still doesn't overly burden mom and pops. And so I just put my email in the chat and would love to hear if you have any ideas along those lines, or we can engage on feedback once we get some ideas on once we start finalizing our language on that amendment.
Well, and in the past, what people have done is, said if you own 3 or fewer or, properties, you're exempt from the provisions of the bill. And I know a lot of legislators and activists for renters don't like doing that because it creates a bifurcated system where you have different rights depending on how many units your, property owner has. And so I wondered if that's what you're thinking of, or are you thinking of something else like income threshold, or what is it what direction? And if you could give me that, then I might be able to give you some feedback from folks I've been talking to.
I think we're trying to look to go more on the income route based on how much rental income a landlord is taking in. But we haven't made any final decisions, but that's what we're looking at.
Thank you.
We have another question here. Are you aware of any local governments that are interested in enacting rent controls?
Well, I don't know, for folks who tuned into the committee, there were many local government officials who came out and testified. Some of this is in flux because there's municipal elections happening this year, but we had folks from the Western Slope, from the mountains, from Denver, from Broomfield, Northglenn. We've heard interest from across the state.
All right, any other questions? Well, you can be sure we'll be following the progress of that bill, Representative Mabry, and if there's anything more we can do, just let me know and I'll pass the word on.
Great. Well,
Thank
thank you
you
all.
so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Yes, and Representative Velasco, thank you.
Great. Thanks.
You bet, thank you. Okay, any further discussion on our speakers? If not, then we're going to go ahead and share summaries of other housing bills. Some of them were referred to in one of the questions that have been introduced and being followed up by our volunteer lobbyists with the State Legislative Action Committee. This group meets bi-monthly, just so everyone's aware, to discuss and vote to support, oppose, or monitor bills in the various issue areas. And our housing lobbyists are Kathy Smith and Joe Federer, who's not able to be with us today, Kate Sage Van Houten, and myself. So before we start that, I see Maud has her hand up. Maud.
I was just going to remind folks that we encourage everyone to testify where they have things they want to say on bills, but only, of course, the Legislative Action Committee, Legislative Action Committee lobbyists for housing can say, and the league supports this bill or the league opposes. The rest of us do it as individuals. But our voices are strong. So,
Great.
And thank you everyone who's been involved.
Thanks, Maud. All right, so Kathy, would you like to lead off with
Well,
some summaries?
Can I suggest that we have Kate go first on the two bills that we just discussed to explain sort of the league's positions. We have different positions on the two different bills and why and what's going forward. Is that okay,
Sure.
Kate?
It's fine with me. I thought I was going to be off the hook because they really covered a lot of what I'm going to say, but
All right, the floor is yours, Kate.
thank you very much. I'm going to keep this very brief because we did really cover quite a bit of the two bills, 1115, House Bill 1115 and 1171. The 1115 is really simple. And it doesn't have to be very complex. It's just removing a prohibition for local governments and municipalities and authorities so that they could put in whatever kind of rent policies or stabilization programs make sense for them. And their constituency would vote on it, and it would be a majority of their constituencies that either don't want rent control or stabilization or do want it, and they can come up with different and varieties of forms. We fully supported this because it does provide the local governments and the local constituencies of voters the opportunity to express their will through democracy, and as opposed to a statewide prohibition. So that's why we supported it. Along with our other general housing views and stances about everybody deserving a safe and good environment and within which to live. There's a lot of support for this bill. As you've heard, there's a lot of opposition. We do have coalitions for both this bill and 1171, and I can provide the details for that in a follow-up to this task force meeting. I'm just electronically challenged at the moment on different devices to be able to get it to you in chat. Let's see, does anybody have any questions that they want to ask me about the league stance for 1115?
Yes, I'm sorry, I've not been involved until today. I got an email from our local league and I came to the meeting because some of my colleagues suggested I come with some of my concerns about it. But yeah, could you kind of, just generally go over like how you came to support that one? I'm just very afraid of what I've seen in real time happening where my son's tried to live in LA. He finally gave up and moved to San Luis Obispo because there's such a problem with young people trying to find housing in Los Angeles and other places with rent control like New York. And
Right.
He knew of a situation where a woman was in a terribly abusive relationship and terrified to leave her husband because they were in a rent controlled environment. And she finally ended up being homeless. And there are so many unintended consequences to this kind of thing. And there's no balance. And literally, people are paying $1,100 rent for one apartment, and the apartment identical to it across the hall is $4,200.
Sure.
And it's just, I'm worried about the unintended consequences. And I must share with you, with regard to these, for the other issue I mentioned to Ms. Gonzalez, I had called her office continually with a few people that I know with regard to these application fees, because the application fees are just outrageous and they're not good for the landlords either, because
we're going to be talking about that particular bill very shortly. So I want to really stay.
They never got back.
Right. I want to stay on 1115 and 1171, and I'll try to address your particular concerns.
Right. But the other thing about 1171, I have people I know that are property managers, and none of them knew if it had to do with non-renewal of leases. And the legislation doesn't say that. It talks about evictions. That's really kind of misleading. It needs to state that it has to do with non-renewal of leases. I mean, I'm sure most people, like Ms. Gonzalez said, have good relationships with their landlords. And I'm sure there's a lot of slumlords out there. But the more small landlords sell out because they can't deal with this to these hedge fund people, those are the people who we really need to be worrying about. And I just don't want to undermine the good that's already out there with something that means well, that could do more harm in the future sustainably. And
understandable.
And with regard to the economist, he's not, I don't believe that person's an economist there. He's an a consultant for insurance. I mean, actual economist, my son said he could get the data to us about all of this stuff if I needed it, because he's really passionate. And that's kind of why I'm here, because of the hard times that he's had after graduating, with honors from a college out in LA, wanting to make a life out there for himself. And, these things have done harm to he and a lot of the kids he knew. So that's kind of why I'm here. Thank you.
Okay, we need to keep going though, because we have quite a lot of bills to cover in the summarization. I want to share with you that there is no enforcement of creating any agencies that enforce or establish regulations regarding rent control in 1115. It is just allowing local governments to be able to talk amongst the community and the developers and the businesses within that community to make it possible for them to do something different than what currently exists, which is a prohibition on any rent stabilization or rent control issues. As far as personal anecdotes are concerned, I've lived in San Francisco in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and I moved away in late 80s. I was living in rent control, and I know a lot about the vagaries of living in rent control under many different economies, both recessions and inflations. They are expecting that this impact, if chosen by a local government to enact, will be carefully considered, and they also have the ability to disenact it. And then local governments also have the ability to say they don't want rent control. If that's what they want for their local government, that's what they can do. This particular bill does not set anything in motion other than remove a restriction that currently exists for statewide municipalities and governments. 1171 is a different sort of animal, and I didn't quite grasp the non-renewal of leases part, so I'm going to have to look into that. I can't address that myself. Maybe Kathy can. What we focused on was the relocation process for the no-fault eviction, including the notice provisions, which they have a graduated system depending on how long you've been a tenant of the building. If you're being asked to leave because of renovations, or the owner is going to occupy, or a family member will occupy. There's a lot of built-in long notification periods that we have questions about that I'm going to get in front of the sponsors. And additionally, there's this relocation assistance of up to $4,000 that seems more than onerous, which I don't know if that's a good selling point to keep it in there so that people don't just have a lot of no fault evictions for no good reason. But we still are in monitor position because we have questions about that particular section of the bill. As far as the codifying of what things are reasonable for terms of for just cause of eviction, I think that's completely reasonable, and it really does support the tenants, which are in a power position of weakness compared to landlords. And because of that power dynamic, we tend to look towards the tenant rights, because the landlords have so much more rights, so many more rights, and so many more resources than the tenant does. So that's what I have to say for that.
So Kate, are you able to see the hands raised on your screen?
I cannot.
All right, so
So
Julie
you-
and Kathy both have hands up, so let's go to Julie first.
Excellent.
Got to unmute. I got my hand on. So I have questions on both, but when I read through the eviction legislation, at least the components of what would be in it, a couple things popped up at me, and I thought I just mentioned them to you. One is, what in the heck's a substantial violation? Seems like, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, because this could be really hard if the threshold, I'm thinking of a small landlord again. If the threshold is so onerous that anything can happen, then the landlord does have a problem with potentially someone creating lots of nuisances, but arguing it never reaches a substantial violation. And maybe there's something there with respect to multiple occurrences that is equivalent to a substantial violation. I don't know about that.
I
but
believe it
anyway,
would be I believe that would be a condition that would be written into the lease. Those would be defined terms within the lease. But
Okay.
you're right, it isn't very clearly stated, and that was some of the issues we had with the bill drafting. I think amendments are going to be proposed that are going to tighten things up to a certain extent. So
Yeah.
sorry
Okay,
to
yeah, I see.
address you right now, but go ahead.
Yeah, it's defined in law elsewhere. And I just, without seeing a site, you know, I just read it as it was. And
Sure.
so apparently that will be cleaned up. Back on the rent controls, and I've mentioned this to Maude since I've come from the Federal Reserve. I'm not in favor of any type of price controls having come up through that line of thinking, just because of the economic consequences that inevitably occur because of them. But setting that aside, because I understand this bill is not to say a municipality should or should not do it. And I do understand individual politicians might want it, but I think getting to a municipality is still a pretty high bar. But the question that comes to my mind is, why was this written into law to begin with? So what occurred that made, you know, some year in the legislature saw it important enough to include it?
I can answer that if anybody else doesn't know.
Go for it.
So I live in Boulder County, and 40 years ago, there was a tenants union in the city of Boulder, and they had convinced the city of Boulder to implement rent control. And the city was poised to do that. And rather than accept that, the apartment association, realtors, a few others got together to put this into the statute to keep Boulder from implementing rent control. And they believed it was a slippery slope and other communities would follow suit. And so it's been in the statute ever since.
And it's primarily to benefit the business of the landlords.
Thanks,
just wanna
Anne Marie,
make-
for that information.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I don't want to get into a discussion of all the economics, but there's a lot of spillover consequences of rent control.
Sure.
So I think there's enough research out there. This would be an interesting question for municipalities to put before their voters. I think there's just a lot that's changed in the last 40 years, but thanks for the background of legislative history. That's
Mhm.
pretty interesting.
All right, let's go to Kathy.
Thanks. I think I'm unmuted now. I wanted to address a few of the comments. The substantial violation is defined elsewhere in law, and they should have made a citation to that. So that's probably, hopefully, a cleanup thing. And as far as the local control of rents, it is, we're not enacting a statewide rent control. We're just allowing local governments to consider, and hopefully they will consider all the pros and cons. That's a kind of an argument for the communities, but they did pass some amendments that have some guardrails. One of them was that similar rentals are to be treated the same. So that avoids what's happened in New York and Los Angeles, where you have things next to each other, apartments next to each other that are or aren't rent controlled. So that's a guardrail now. They did make it so that newer buildings who are undergoing financing, so that a rolling 15-year period, you're exempt from any kind of rent control stabilization provision in the buildings over 15 years old. And that they also had some additional provisions that I think are important guardrails going forward. They put a basement on the lowest amount that you could control rent at the CPI plus 3%. So inflation is allowed for in there. So I think the guardrails have really attempted to be trade-offs for things that they know have gone wrong in other places in the past that have had rent control provisions. So for 1171, the just cause eviction, I agree with the comments about the leases. That's not clear in there. The original intent was supposed to be just laying out reasons why you could evict someone. And it's kind of grown from there. And that's why instead of a support position, we're monitoring it for now to see what the amendments are going to look like. So thanks everyone for their interest.
I do have two other bills that I need to present. Are we ready to move on to those? Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry, Kate, go ahead.
That's okay. That's all right. I get it. So I have two Senate bills that are going through very handily, I might add. Senate Bill 23001 is the Authority of Public-Private Collaboration Unit. It's the most difficult thing for me to say for some reason and read. Public-Private Collaboration Unit for Housing. And essentially, this so far let's see, let me go back and do this in order. We are in support of this. We have not submitted a letter of written testimony as yet. We have fiscal note summary, and we have funding sources information. So get ready for some numbers. Basically, what this does is this is a funding bill that provides for how this new process of using funds out of the unused state-owned real property fund, and it's administered by the public-private collaboration unit within the Department of Personnel and Administration. So it's just a lot of how we handle funding sources for housing developments for affordable housing. 5 million is going to come from the general fund, and 8 million is going to come from DOLA, which is the Department of Local Affairs under the Division of Housing. The way this money is going to be allocated is right off the bat, we have 2 million going to the Dowd Junction Eagle, Colorado project, which is a proof of concept of setting up workforce housing for CDOT employees to be able to get them into Glenwood Canyon and the I-70 corridor to maintain it and keep it open and operational for transport. Then there'll be an $11 million left over for similar projects throughout the state. And when I was listening to the committee hearings in the initial stages, all the proposed housing projects are in, for now, in rural Colorado, but all the urban areas are also in support of this particular bill. The next one is kind of related, and it has to do with Senate Bill 23-3035. It's the Middle Income Housing Authority Act. This one is simplest of all because it really has nothing to do with money. It's basically a follow-on to last year's bill, Senate Bill 22-232, which established the Middle Income Housing Authority. And it basically was expanding the ability for the housing authority to work with public-private partnerships, which again, we have that special unit for that. And it also provides for some tax relief for the developers of the affordable rental housing to stimulate and incentivize developers to develop middle income housing. And it's there are some definition of what middle income housing is in our state, but I am not going to bore you with that right at the moment. I'm going to also make my summaries available for anyone to read following this when we have a place to put it. So, questions?
I see no hands raised, Kate, so thank you very much for those summaries. So let's move.
I have a quick question. The concept of giving tax relief to developers for housing that's not for poor people, but that's for middle income people. I mean, that's kind of a new concept, and I just wonder what people think about that.
It's being promoted as part of the reason to support this bill, because the developers actually can recoup their costs from tenants from the housing development and the way it's structured financially.
In my area, a lot of people think of developers as greedy bastards, excuse my language, and I'm not saying I think that, but I get a lot of opposition in talking about anything that gives developers a break versus homeowners or residents.
Well, mostly this is mostly to provide for public-private partnerships. So the people that are developing under P3s are less interested in being the greedy developer that you're used to. They are much more involved in being part of the community and may live in the community and may actually want to serve the community. It's been my experience here in Lakewood that we have a major developer that is doing that kind of work right now.
Well, and I think there are some good developers. That's why I'm saying I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think it may be worth watching in the future as this proceeds to see who's this really benefiting, whether it's benefiting the public or developers. Just something to think about.
Yeah. I'll put that in my notes. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Anne Marie. So we have Julie with a hand up. Oh, you're muted, Julie.
Okay, try that again. So yeah, these public-private partnerships, I don't know how else you get this housing built because the input costs are just, so extraordinary, particularly here in Colorado. My question was on the last potential piece of legislation you mentioned, and I didn't catch the name of the fund that it would come from, but my question would be, if it is coming from an existing fund, what would no longer be funded?
That's a very good question, and 5 million out of the general fund. So they would make that up in other revenues, whatever. I mean, as we've been working the revenue, Maude could probably discuss this better than I can, but my understanding is that we've been having surpluses of revenue that we have to refund in Tabor. And this would be something that that would not be an issue for 5 million to come from the general fund. But that's just me, that's my viewpoint. And the other 8 million is coming from federal dollars, mostly grants to DOLA, funding that goes into DOLA, which is substantially federal dollars, which is not subject to Tabor.
Maude, would you like to comment further on that?
And Maude, as you do, this is just all on top of the 123 funding?
Yeah, the 123 funding specifically comes from, in years where there is a Tabor refund, specifically comes from the money that would otherwise be refunded through Tabor refunds. Tabor otherwise limits how much can be spent. And so if this bill isn't explicitly saying that that 5 million would come from Tabor refunds, then it's in the mix fighting with all the other bills that require medium to small appropriations. And
so should I make
it'll stay in appropriations presumably until after the long bill, the appropriations bill passes, and then the committee knows how much is left, and then there's a food fight, or we're having a presentation on quadratic voting. So look on the state calendar, which is how the House Democrats caucus has been voting on those bills that land in appropriations and need how they help decide to divvy up that last little pot of money.
Okay, so would people recommend that we should suggest to the bill sponsors that they amend and specify that this comes from the Tabor refund pool?
Would that be? I'm reluctant to so Tabor refunds aren't going to last forever. Aren't necessarily going to last forever, and when that goes away, if we end up back in not a Tabor surplus situation, then everything, including the Prop 123 housing funding, is going to be in the mix fighting for general fund money.
Should it remain that way? Should everybody be able to just, say they go fight it out in the legislature, and that's democracy in action?
So really, we should tell everybody we know that we need to repeal Tabor.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
I'm on that.
That's the fix.
Yes.
And then some of you know I've spent a couple decades working for the budget director in a different state, and then then if there's no money, the answer to everything is no, and if there is, then there's a food fight for new money, for new programs. So probably more than most of you wanted to know.
Yeah.
Kathy posted in the chat that we have a news access and literacy task force, and they are sponsoring a presentation on quadratic voting tomorrow evening, 5:30. The name of the present whole evening is Sunshine and Shadows. So look at the LWVCO calendar to sign up if you'd like to know more about. It's actually a very interesting tool.
All right, thank you. So let's go to Kathy.
Just wanted to clarify for the Senate Bill 35, the Middle Income Housing Authority passed last session as a pilot study. So the Senate Bill 35 this session is kind of a cleanup bill for that. So it's kind of the ship has sailed for doing anything directly, and the cleanup are things like for the public private partnership, the commercial parts don't get the tax credits, things like that. And I think they had a couple of board members, but it's just a cleanup bill.
Correct. It's mostly administrative in nature.
Great, thank you, Kate, for that info. And Kathy, would you like to review your bill summaries?
I was thinking, Trish, since Jenny had concerns about one of your bills, that maybe you should go first to make sure we get it in.
Okay, and I'm going to summarize, first of all, House Bill 23-1095, which deals with prohibited provisions in rental agreements. And these are mainly there for tenant protections. And some examples of those are the leases cannot allow for a waiver to a jury trial. And that was amended to read that now the parties, either party can agree, both parties, to waiver that jury trial, but there has to be an agreement between the two. So that was an amendment. There can be no penalties for the tenant failure to provide notification of non-renewal. That was also amended to read with exceptions for actual losses to the landlord. So I'm thinking that means if you didn't give notice of renewal of your lease, and all of a sudden now the landlord is not able to rent that property for a period of time, that maybe that is a penalty that can be assessed. There's also implied covenant of quiet enjoyment, not able to be, in the agreement, but that also has been amended, that the landlord cannot be responsible for third-party violations that would occur that are beyond the landlord's control. Landlord can charge a markup for services, but they cannot exceed 2% or $10 a month for an amount that a landlord may be billed for a service in that unit. And they cannot pursue actions for possession based only on non-payment of utilities. In other words, there cannot be evictions just because utilities are not being paid. That did pass on the second reading Friday, and it passed today on the third reading with those amendments. Kathy, have you got a comment? No, I'm sorry, I saw your hand up. All right, then House Bill 23-1099 has to do with the portable screening reports for residential leases. That too passed today on the third reading. And that basically is saying that a landlord can accept the screening report that's prepared by a consumer reporting agency that the prospective tenant would acquire within the 30 days that they're applying for that occupancy of an apartment. So that basically what that's doing is protecting the tenant from some of those financial barriers of having to pay all of those application fees, that they can present that consumer report that contains all that information that a landlord may need in approving a rental. If the tenant comes in and provides that, they cannot charge an application fee. And if the landlord does obtain and that credit report and the rental application is denied, the landlord must provide a copy of that report along with the right that they have to dispute that. And yeah, that basically is a summary of those two bills, and they are moving on to the Senate. So I'm particularly supportive of, and the League supports both of these bills, but that application fee, I think one of our attendees today spoke to that can become a big barrier to people finding housing because of the high application fees that have to be paid every time. If they're looking at 3 to 4 places and they have to pay an application for those 3 to 4, that takes a dip into the pocket for monies that they can be used for rent. So the League is supportive of 1095 and 1099. Okay, any comments? That's the best I can do in summarizing those two, but any comments on either of those questions? Yeah, the main thing is they're providing, as Senator Gonzalez spoke to us today about providing those protections for the tenants. It's making everything out there stated and obvious so that everyone knows where they stand. All right, Kathy.
Thanks. I'm gonna we're covering a lot of housing bills this session. And Joe Fader has a couple of bills too that I'll talk about, but I'd like to talk about, I think the most important one in this group is House Bill 1190. It's affordable housing right of first refusal. And we are currently in the LAC voting about whether or not to support this bill. So I don't think we have a final stance, but hopefully it will be a support. It has its first hearing tomorrow. And what it does is it creates a first right of refusal with certain exceptions for local governments, so city, counties, and housing authorities, to purchase multi-unit residential properties for long-term affordable housing. Long-term meaning that the annual rent will not exceed the rent for households of a given size at a certain area median income for a minimum of 100 years. And the local government agrees not to raise a rent for any unit by more than the bill's specified increase cap. And it excludes properties that are less than 5 residential units in urban counties and 3 in rural or rural resort counties. There's no appropriation. And I think this is a transformational bill in that we're doing a lot of talking about developing new affordable housing, but we also need to preserve what we have. And if we're losing affordable housing, and a lot of the older affordable housing had time limits, 20, 30, 40 year time limits that we're running out right now. And we're losing some of these to market rate developers and the equity firms that are building buying the multi-unit buildings. So this gives the local governments a chance to purchase the properties at the market rate. And hopefully they'll be able to use things like Proposition 123 funding to do so. So any questions about that bill? Okay.
Yeah, Kathy, I don't have any questions. I've just read the summary, not the whole bill, so bear with me, but I would imagine there's going to be pushback on that because of the amount of time that lapses to closing. I would think that's where the owner would have an issue, is potentially because the municipality is going to have to get funding probably, which may be 123, but may not, depending on what's available in there. And
yeah,
so,
the local, I think it's a 2-week period of time that the local government needs to decide whether or not they're going to pursue this. So there's a 2-week yes, no period of time. And then there's a 90-day to go under contract and another
180.
180 days, okay, to actually close. So it's not onerous amount of time, especially, I mean, the seller knows within 2 weeks, whether it's an issue. But I really think this is one of the only ways we're going to be able to preserve and retain affordable housing long-term. And preservation is a lot cheaper than building from scratch.
Yeah.
Some
No,
fact-
yeah, and I don't disagree with that. I'm just, it would be interesting to see how municipalities view the likelihood of having sufficient funding to do this, and be interesting. I guess this is any multifamily property, right? Not just affordable?
No, any multifamily, although, the more affordable ones, the idea is the naturally occurring affordable properties, which are usually, older and cheaper. But it could be anything.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Julie. I'll just go down the list now. Joe Fader is currently asking for a support vote for Senate Bill 082. It's the Colorado Fostering Success Voucher Program. Prime sponsor is Rachel Zenzinger. It's a bipartisan bill. Senator Kirkmeyer, Representative Amable, and Representative Michelson Genet. And we're asking for support. It's gone through its first hearing, sent unamended with a unanimous vote to appropriations. And basically it establishes the Colorado Fostering Success Voucher Program that provides housing vouchers and case management services to eligible youth who were in the foster care system. Youth ages 18 to 26 can apply for this. It's jointly developed through Department of Human Services and the Division of Housing within Department of Local Affairs. It does have a large fiscal note, but Senator Zenzinger is also the chair of the Joint Budget Committee, so theoretically it has a good chance of getting through. But it requires a total of 2.8 million to multiple agencies, paid primarily from the general fund, but there's also some federal funds involved. In the support opposition, there's no opposition positions in the lobbyist filings, mostly supporting with a few monitoring. So hopefully this will be on our list of support bills. Any questions? Okay, moving on. House Bill 1120. Eviction protections for residential tenants. And we have a support position on this. And what this bill does is it requires mediation between a landlord and a residential tenant in an eviction proceeding if the tenant receives the supplemental security income, so disability or TANF, that kind of thing, through the Colorado Works program. Mediation is not required if the tenant does not disclose that they are receiving the assistance. And basically it's forced mediation for these for folks basically on disability who are facing eviction. It increases the time if the eviction does go through, it increases the time from 10 days to 30 days before they actually have to be out of the location. And there were some amendments last week in committee that I think are fairly important amendments. One is that it exempts 501c3 nonprofit organizations that already offer opportunities for mediation to residential tenants. And it carves out landlords with 5 or fewer single family homes and no more than 5 total rental units. It also states that the mandatory mediation is provided at no cost to the residential tenant. And in the fiscal note, it basically says that usually mediation is about 2 hours, and for the landlord, it would cost about $75 an hour. So be about $150 cost per tenant per landlord. And so it, let's see, it moved to appropriations on a vote of 9-4, which I think was a party line vote. So any questions about this one? Okay. Another bill that Joe Fader is following, and we're also undergoing a vote for support for this bill. It has a hearing, I believe, tomorrow, is House Bill 1184, low income housing property tax exemptions. It's a bipartisan bill. And basically what it does is it nonprofit organizations, it was designed around Habitat for Humanity, where nonprofit organizations build and sell affordable housing units. And since this started, and this is extending the time period of these tax exemptions, community land trusts have really grown. So this is kind of expanding beyond the model with the Habitat for Humanity and into the community land trust. And in that model, with the community land trust, the land trust holds on to the land for a long period of time, 99 years type thing, and sells the improvement, which is the home. So that makes it cheaper. And basically the homeowner pays taxes on the home, but this is providing for the community land trust to not have to pay taxes on the land portion. So it's for tax purposes separating the land from the home for tax exempt status. And it's extending the time period for this status. It's also up to the local the local government whether or not they grant the tax status. Any questions on this one? Okay. Moving on. House Bill 1186, which is remote participation in residential evictions. We have a support position on this. And it basically allows for throughout the state a normalization where folks can attend eviction proceedings remotely instead of in person. In a lot of cases, it's very difficult for folks, especially in the rural areas, to go to the location where they have to appear in person. They also have to, right now, in a lot of cases, provide filings of documents in person. So this allows for e-filing across the state. So it had a few amendments kind of clarifying some of this, but mostly it's intact and going on to the next step. It's had its first committee meeting. And any questions about this one? Okay. And the last thing I just wanted to mention is that you've probably seen articles in the paper about the governor supporting statewide land use or planning some land use bills that will perhaps delve into areas that have traditionally been local controls, such as zoning. And we have yet to see any bills or draft bills along these lines. So we don't really know what's going to be included and how it's going to be done by, if there's going to be a menu of choices or if it's going to be, things are going to be grandfathered in. We're thinking there'll probably be accessory dwelling units, ADUs, that are included, perhaps higher density housing allowed around transit. And perhaps, something that tries to de-incentivize exclusionary zoning. So, and rent and caps on growth, things like that. But we don't know for sure, haven't seen anything, but that's going to be coming, and it will be something that the league is going to have to weigh the pros and cons. We did sign on to the general principles document, which is just sort of policy principles, and they were in alignment with our league's positions. But you know, the devil's in the details, and we haven't seen the bills yet, which is, I think, a segue to what Trish is going to talk about for next time.
Perfect. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you. Yes, so our next meeting of the Housing Task Force will be Monday, March 20th at 11:45. We will be posting further details on the calendar, but plans right now are to have a Fort Collins city official speak to us about the changes that they made to their land use code last fall and the pushback that they got from a very organized opposition group. They presented a petition to City Council asking for revision or the new code be put to a vote of the community. And so the council has decided to move forward with revisions, and their plan is between now and November to work with the community in listening sessions and developing those changes. But the journey the city of Fort Collins has been on will definitely be getting more attention as the state begins to look at the possible state considerations of those bills that Kathy spoke of that will probably be coming. From what I've read, it's probably going to be late March, and it's going to be a package of bills that we'll probably see. It won't be one large, it'll be a number of smaller bills that are presented. So, and Julie with us today has also been working on editing, revising an article that we will be posting in on some of the league sites concerning the journey that Fort Collins has been on with these land use code changes. So stay tuned for that, but we will be giving you more details on who that will be in the coming week or two here. So yeah, March 20th. So I think that closes us out for today. I really appreciate everyone coming and sticking with us through all these bill summaries. There, as Kathy said, there's a lot going on in the housing front in Colorado, and rightly so, because we hear the word housing crisis almost every day that we open our papers or turn our local news on. So thank you for coming today, and we look forward to our March meeting. And I see Maud has a hand up before we sign off. Oh, you're muted.
I was just going to thank our housing team, you, Trish, Kathy, Kate, and Joe, because it's one thing to sort of see the bills as they go by, a few at a time, but to hear all of them at once. You have a lot that you folks have been reading and following. So thank you. Thank you for all that you're doing on housing.
Thanks, Maud. Kathy?
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. And I just want to tell folks that if you go to the state website and go to legislative action, the LAC at the top of the page has a list of bills, all the bills that the LAC has a position on, and then they have topical tabs. So if you click on the housing tab, that's basically the housing bills that we're following. And there is a custom summary in there that's customized for LAC that talks a little bit about league positions and things, in addition to the sort of legislative summary. So just wanted to make sure that folks know that exists.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. So on that note, we'll take the rest of the day to enjoy the sunshine. We'll see you in March. Thank you.
Thank you all.